It's time to start then. Everybody has joined us, and thank you for that. Welcome to everybody to this webinar on SDGs and trade, and we'll try to see how sustainable trade is. I will present you our panelists in a minute, but let me first explain you why I organized this webinar in the presence of Rebecca Harding from Coriolis. It's because when I discovered the research conducted by Coriolis with a novel approach aiming at matching trade flows against the SDGs, I had the idea to discuss it further, to first hear of the presentation of the research, of course, and then organize exchange of views with the panelists. Of the trade flows that are related to the SDGs, 40% contribute positively to their achievements, and 60% can be seen as hurdles to their realization. That is the main finding, I would say, of the research. But Coriolis' findings also shed a new light on global trade and show that a dramatic and urgent shift is needed if we want to remain on track of 2030, which is the deadline for the realization of the SDGs. As a major global player, the EU has certainly a role to play in framing globalization via the trade patterns, the foreign direct investments, but also the design of new standards. During the European Council of December 2020, the heads of states and governments stressed that the EU will ensure that its trade policy and its trade agreements are consistent with its climate ambition. On the other hand, the recent G7 summit communiqué in June concluded on many aspects, but mainly on the need for long-term shifts in the global economy and society, recognizing the interconnected nature of these global challenges, and also putting trade as a priority for free and fair trade for all, more sustainable trade, resilient and responsive to the need of global citizens. In the meantime, in 2021, the World Economic Forum report on global risks confirms that the risks with the biggest impacts and the highest likelihood are those related to climate change, biodiversity loss, and social inequality. We can definitely not ignore a warning. And I think Coriolis' approach really provides interesting insight on how to address these issues through our trade policies. Yesterday, we had a meeting at the European Parliament with the European Commission on the TSD chapters, the Trade and Sustainable Development chapters, which, of course, is a key topic, while not the sole tool, but key topic to the mainstreaming of the Green Deal and the SDGs in our free trade agreements. Let me tell you that the exchange was quite disappointing, unfortunately, because many MEPs from all the groups did not feel a high level of ambition from the DG Trade. Still working on studies, whereas reports, including European Parliament motions, not later than one of last week that we voted on, the Van Bremt report on the trade policy review and post-COVID, are piling up with concrete proposals. This is crucial since the TSD and other provisions like Paris Agreement or human rights clause are, as essential elements, contribute to the overall credibility of our free trade agreements and also acceptance of trade policy and beyond globalization among the citizens. And this is also important for our upcoming legislation on due diligence for fair, resilient and sustainable value chains that include the respect of human rights, labor rights and environmental standards. And that's precisely the scope, the aim of the Van Bremt report that we just voted on. The objectives of this exchange, which will be rich, I'm sure, is to put figures on trade flows with respect to their sustainability and examine also whether the EU does enough and if it can commit to deliver more, and if so, how. So I will immediately give the floor to Rebecca Harding, who is the CEO of Coriolis, and then we'll hear about our next speakers. Rebecca, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And if I may, I'd just like to share my screen so that people can see some of the numbers that I will create. Okay, I can't share my screen. So what I'll do is I will just talk through a few ideas. So the situation with trade is that trade has been central to the debate over the last 18 months, particularly in relation to COVID. And what I want to do today is look at whether or not we're missing an opportunity at this stage to make the most of an appetite to change things, not just in the policy arena, but also amongst banks and amongst corporates as well, in order to make trade sustainable. As Olivier said, only 40% of trade contributes positively towards sustainable development goals. How do we know this? We know this because we measure the products that are traded all the way around the world, and this is data that's available to everybody. There's no secret source with all of this, nothing particularly magical about it. We look at the way in which those products are coded. So we look at what's called the HS codes, which is how the tax authorities check what's coming into a country and going out of the country. And we look at those HS codes,
Rebecca?
we match them to sustainable development goals.
Rebecca, let me interrupt you. If I may, you can normally share your screen now, so you should be able to show the slides if you wish.
Okay, so who can share? So if I just go, that's lovely, thank you. So, close, apologies. So the question is, we need to look at ways in which we can look at sustainability in the round. Because we're able to match HS codes to sustainable development goals, what we need to be able to do is look at how we can measure sustainability, not just in terms of the way we trade at the moment, but how we can change trade in the future. The goal of most of the people that I work with within a banking and a corporate community don't want deliberately to be contributing negatively towards sustainable development goals. A lot of the organisations that I work with see trade as something that is positive and something that creates economic development, economic growth and economic welfare all the way around the world. The trade not aid agenda is an important one, but in order to be able to make trade fulfill all of its potential, we need to look at sustainability in the round. It's not just about climate change. And in a way, that's a problem. And it's one of the things that makes it so difficult to talk about trade. Trade at the moment is ultimately unsustainable. It contributes a huge amount to environmental destruction around the world, emissions and so on. And so people say, well, trade isn't sustainable, we should do less of it. But it does have positive sustainability impacts through its contribution to creating business growth in parts of the world that otherwise would not be able to create appropriate levels of economic activity. So we do need to look at this in the round. And we do need to understand that at a policy level, we are moving towards more and more sustainability disclosure. So supply chains, bank supply chains, net zero, all of these types of things, they're very good in principle things. And because we're moving towards that by 2022 here in the EU, the UK and the US, what that means is that everybody else is going to be brought into line. So there's regulatory pull, if you like, behind all of this, push or pull, call it what you want. But it's not the only solution. We need to make sure that we have incentivization there as well. So from a policy point of view, if we're going to build back better, and sustainability is our only way of doing this, then we also need to have a set of incentives that work alongside everything else. Now, if you look at trade finance is around 80% of the value of all global trade. And the issue that trade finance has is that obviously, because it's funding an awful lot of commodity trade around the world, although it's very large in size, it actually isn't as large in sustainability terms as, for example, sustainable investment. So if you look at the US by itself, US accounts for 17 trillion of assets under management in the sustainable investment side. Globally, there are $30 trillion in assets under management in sustainable investment. If you look at global trade finance, the value is about 17 trillion. So think of what a difference we could make to the world if we could make trade sustainable. But there are some real issues here. So for every 5 million of goods that are traded by the top 10 countries, only 1 million align with positive sustainable development goals. 4 million do not. In other words, only 20% for the top 10 countries around the world, only 20% of trade aligns with positive sustainable development goals. If you look at cargo ships, 2 to 3% of global emissions are contributed to by cargo ships shipping stuff around that we use every single day, and 18% to overall pollution. Sustainable development goals that matter for work, economic development and inequality don't feature in trade statistics at all. So as I said, we've matched sustainable development goals to the type of products and services that are traded around the world. And you can barely find objectives that match with the things that really matter to people on the ground: equality, economic development, fair and equal trade. It barely features in trade statistics at all. And yet everyone in the trade community is thinking about this. Everyone's talking about it. There are huge compliance departments in banks at the moment being recruited to deal with it. So clearly trade needs to catch up. But because there's this proliferation of research, of metrics, of money, it's very difficult to sift through and find out exactly what the important points are. So I thought it would be helpful just to understand the problem first. So what I've done here is from our data, I've looked at two sectors that are particularly important within the global trade finance system. And what we do with our data is, first of all, we match particular HS codes to sustainable development goals. But then what we also do is we look at a bilateral trade flow in both directions. So we look at not just, let's say, the UK's trade with Kenya, we also look at Kenya's trade with the European Union, and we have algorithms that create an average of those two data points. So it means that we can understand the difference between what a country is saying that it's doing in its official trade statistics and what it's actually doing when you look at the measured statistic or the mirrored statistic there. So this mirroring is absolutely key. And let's have a look at tropical hardwood and hardwood altogether as an example. It's the chief executive of a large corporate or a bank could theoretically go to jail if they are funding trade in any type of thing that will deplete rainforests or be associated with illegal logging. And yet there is a huge amount of trade in tropical hardwood that is going on. The US underreports its trade in tropical hardwood. Denmark, France, Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, Belgium, they are the biggest culprits in terms of divergence between what they say they're doing and what they're actually doing. These are all European Union countries. Although having said that, Vietnam and Indonesia barely report their statistics at all. And some of the biggest culprits actually in terms of volume are in emerging markets. But you can see in terms of percentage difference, when we take Vietnam and Indonesia off the scale, because they are literally off the scale. Some of the countries that are creeping in here as having the most divergent, in other words, the least truth about what they're trading, are within the European framework. I count the United Kingdom in there still. I'm one of those that does. I will never leave. But untreated oak as well, this is all about consumer demand. All of these different products, it's about changing the nature of consumer demand within the EU, but beyond, in terms of what we're saying to countries that we need to import in order to service that demand. So Germany and Austria don't report well at all. We're seeing consumer demand still there, still buoyant, and it's that's creating this divergence between what countries are saying they're doing and what they're actually doing. So how do they get away with that? Well, it's because of the tax and regulatory system, the tariff system, that allows them to shunt certain types of products to another code, or that allows them to be able to say they're trading something in one month and not in another, but in fact, when you mirror that trade, you realise that there is something going on that's actually being under or over-reported. The same thing happens with secondhand clothing. So, I mean, if you look at the rate at which secondhand clothing, used clothing, cloth is growing, the importers and apologies, there's a typing mistake here. This should say importers of used clothing. USA, Germany, France, Japan, United Kingdom, Italy, Canada. Again, it's the leading countries in the world that are importing unsustainable, cheap clothing all the way around the world. You can see how much it's been growing. We are, despite our attitude that we should have sustainable clothing, there's a lot that actually isn't that's going on. And again, look at where we're importing it from: China, India, Pakistan, Germany, Vietnam. These are all economies that are actually fueling our desire for cheap or even second-hand clothing. So you can see the scale of the problem that's there, and we urgently need to refocus. We need to focus on changing tariff regimes, changing tax regimes, but because we must avoid greenwash. So EU sustainability disclosure reporting is a step in the right direction. It certainly scared the banks. The EU taxonomy, which is all about how companies must be tracked in order for their green status within a supply chain, that banks are now having to comply with as well. That taxonomy has been agreed. It's a positive move forward. The UK is starting to do the same thing. We've got measures in the US. We've got the huge supply chain review in the US was also focused around human rights. Although you have to say, was that actually about human rights, or was it about the requirement to limit China's access to US supply chains? And also the recovery packages that are out there post-pandemic are focused around green bonds, green investing, and so on. So there is a momentum that's beginning to build around this post-pandemic, but it's still not enough. Where does the EU stand on all of this? Now, I would argue that the EU's trade power is massive in the world. And if you look at what's happening around the world, look at the US and China, they're locked in this strategic competition. They're having a battle of who has the most influence. Look at the US and Russia. They've always had this sort of competition going on, playing different games with one another. But if you look at the EU's role in all of this is actually as a regulatory superpower. So the EU, because it controls around 32% of world trade and has a wider reach beyond that as well because of supply chains, it's able to set regulations and have an influence over the way in which we make trade sustainable in the long run. The EU's approach is more multilateral, so it has the opportunity to bring others into the system. Now, it has to be careful because when deals were trying to be struck last year with Mercosur, for example, there was a backlash against trying to introduce sustainability criteria on economic development grounds, and particularly the Brazilian negotiators were keen to point out that there were parts of the country that couldn't get electricity and gas, so it was difficult to impose those types of sustainability criteria. But it really is important that the EU sticks to all of this. The EU's trade strategy at the moment is focused on decent work and social justice, opportunities for all, free and fair trade, and creating an authoritative and autonomous statement about where the EU stands in terms of trade. That is really important because there is potential to build human rights, to build sustainability through there. The EU taxonomy itself, which is how banks are now being regulated, is focused largely on climate and biodiversity. And what that does is it actually means that the focus is on the climate rather than on some of the other areas which would align more closely with trade policy. So these need to be brought together and they need to be streamlined because there's still a risk of greenwash because there is so much noise in this space that it's difficult for organisations to fall into line, and they need to fall into line quickly, because otherwise climate targets are missed. But let's have a look at some of the good things that are happening within the EU. And here I have taken out, the UK. So I've looked at the growth in intra-regional trade in sustainability sectors, so particularly electric cars, wind turbines and photovoltaic panels. And if you look at all of these, trade within the European Union in all of these sustainable sectors has actually been growing fairly quickly, so above 6.5% on an annualized basis since 2016. Now, that tells a very strong story that trade within the European Union, between European Union members, is definitely beginning to focus on some of these areas. And so we need to accelerate that process. And I guess what I would say as I start to draw some conclusions, evidence-based policy is essential to get buy-in to all of this. And because we do know how to measure these things, in a way, there's no excuse for not doing it. Because if you can chuck a few numbers out there about where the risks are, then that makes a huge difference to the extent of the buy-in that we will get behind all of this. The banks want to help, but they need metrics as well. They want to be able to incentivize credit lines. They want to be able to have tax incentives and so on. Regulation in and for itself in a policy framework won't necessarily be enough. So let's have a look at what the banks need to know in terms of metrics, because banks account for around 80% of the value of trade through the finance that they provide. So if we can alter the way in which the trade is financed, we can then alter the way trade becomes sustainable. And if you look here, they need to know about products and transactions for ESG. We can do that with this product-based approach. They need to know about the company's ESG status. It's becoming akin to anti-money laundering and KYC. The know your goods element to all of this is very, very important. Again, we can do this by having a more systematic approach to the products that are supplied. Supply chains are important, and again, an advantage of using HS codes is you can collect the related HS codes in order to be able to understand where those supply chains are and how sustainable they are. And this is something in Coriolis that we're really developing in a big way through what we call our Cosmos consortium. Cosmos is our world. Cosmos is a book by Alexander Humboldt, which was all about measuring the world and its species and its flora and fauna. And then we can also look, of course, at an aggregated level at the ESG risk status of the country and its own regulations, again, attached to this product level approach. We can start to measure this. We can map top products to sustainable development goals. We've done this on our website if you'd like to check it out. We've looked at where the green impact products are around for the top 20 economies, and we've looked at the negative imports as well. You can take a look at this and you can play with it. It's on our website. Please do have a look. All of this is possible to do because we've worked out this way of mapping the whole of world trade to these sustainable development goals. And the next thing is that we then allow companies on our system to register their product, and that again gives us a mechanism for assessing their sustainable development goals, but also their dual use goods status, which is another part of sustainability, the whole governance and fraud side of things as well. So the company can actually be tracked for everything on our system, and this is a way that we need to start moving towards this process so that SMEs in particular know how they can improve. And as I said, the world is our cosmos. We need to be able to measure this. We need to be able to take a spatial finance approach. In other words, to look at countries, supply chains, companies and products. If banks are going to be able to understand where they should be intervening, where there should be positive credit incentives and where the credit incentives should be negative. So just to shift in the interest of time so that everybody else can speak, just to shift to some final conclusions, we can measure sustainable trade. We're at the beginning of a journey. We have a consortium, and do contact us if you'd like to be involved with all of that. We can take this to a company and product level. It is possible to do. The regulatory frameworks in the EU are beginning to be there. That's a very, very positive thing, but it needs to work alongside the financial services sector, particularly trade finance and banks, in order to incentivize trade finance and sustainable trade, as well as to compel it. There's nothing worse than a department of 100 compliance officers who are all running around chasing pieces of paper. It's an excuse for not doing something. We need to make sure that we've got excuses for doing something, and the credit system is a very good way of providing those types of incentives through tax, changes in tariffs and credit guarantees. They're all viable policy options, and now that we can measure sustainable trade, we should look at those as well. I think above all, we all need to work together. This isn't a competition. The problem's universal, and so must the solution be. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rebecca Harding. And yes, your conclusion is we need to work together, and that's also why we're here together today, because you developed a very interesting methodology in order to measure sustainability of trade flows, and this is what brings us together. I would like to give immediately the floor to Isabelle Durant to give us international perspective and also a UN perspective, of course, because Isabelle Durant is the acting Secretary General of the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, and very active on these issues as well. So Isabelle, you have the floor.
Thank you, Saskia, and good morning, everyone. So I just would like to complexify what Rebecca Harding presented. I just say complexify. I mean, it's of course not to contradict, but I look at the things through the perspective of the developing countries. That's my job. That's my responsibility. And it's true that when you start, Rebecca, with the fact, the share of trade in the world, it's true that when you look at some region of the world, and especially Africa, for instance, since UNCTAD was born in 1964, it was at that time decided or wished that Africa could double its part in its share in the global worldwide trade, and it doesn't happen. Africa, even the share of Africa decreased since 1964. So we have to look at the things, of course, through the European lens, but also through the lens of the countries, part of them, of course, not all, where the share of trade is not really evenly shared first. Secondly, I think that when you speak about the SDG, we know, all of us, we know that it's 17 SDG, and especially 16. Also, we try as best as possible to connect them, each other, because of course one is related to another. And frankly, I'm interested to the methodology that you use, because you know that in the UN we are working with a number of indicators. It's really a kind of a forest of indicator by each SDG. And so the way to apply it to trade is something which is of course key, but also very difficult, because trade imply a lot of activities inside trade. Trade is just the exchange of goods or services. And that's another issue. You know that international trade evolved a lot, and now the part of the part of goods is less important than the part of services. And trade in services is really the trend of the future. I would not say that there is no reality of a good exchange, but the services are now, with the digitalization, changing completely the things that we have to integrate in our model, because this trend will not stop from one day to another with the digital economy, which are for me the options to meet SDG in 2030. Well, between us, I'm fully sure that it will never be completely achieved in 2030, so, especially after COVID, because it's a tremendous setback for the developing country. We are 20 years behind where we are just before the COVID regarding poverty, regarding a lot of socioeconomic aspects. But whatever is the timing, SDGs are staying our compass, and we have to work with them. So I think that what you said about the internal market in the regional market in the EU is also something that we have to encourage, regional economic integration, and especially for the smallest one. I mean, for the SMEs, etc., and especially post-COVID in developing world, it's so easier to export on regional level. Of course, all the model was done in order to put developing countries in the global economy from one day to another, if I could say, in a mondialization which was not really well regulated. And it's true that, for instance, all the measure, the non-tariffary measure, and I know that it's important for the EU to have non-tariffary measure to develop some products, quality of products, preferences, etc. But we have to realize that for an SMEs in Africa or everywhere in the world, address and all those non-tariffary barriers is something which is frankly impossible. We are providing to them all the information about the non-tariffary measure, but when you would like to export in the EU, for instance, it's really a kind of parcours du combattant for the small entrepreneurs. Of course, it's easier for the MNEs, but I will come back to that later. So first of all, regional integration is something that we have to encourage through different means. Reshaping value chain. I think that we've seen with the COVID, because COVID exacerbated all the trends pre-existing before COVID, but we have to reshape the value chain. And it's something which is also important. We have seen that when China is the manufacturing of the 40% of all the manufacturation, that's something which is totally unsustainable. So we have to really, it's the case for vaccine and all the medical production that we have seen now, that it's so important that it could be produced close to the consumer or close to the country in order to have a kind of capacity to monitor the solution to a pandemic, for instance. It has to be reshaped. Third thing, you spoke about technology, electric cars and all those aspects related to technology. True, but it's also for the developing countries an absolute necessity, first of all, to diversify, because a lot of them are depending of commodities or rare element material. And all what we need for electric cars, it's lithium, cobalt, and all those new material. It's key that we can transform what was done with the previous fossil issues through a supply chain which is correct, fair, and not as it is the case, as we know, for a lot of minerals. So that's an enormous challenge for the developing countries to be supported in productive capacity to really sustainably be able to exploit those material, but also to take the benefit of that regarding the just transition and the capacity to really provide income to the country. Thirdly, we have to change some rules in the WTO, for sure. That's not an easy issue. We have a new DG now with a lot of ambition, and I hope that she could succeed on some aspect. But when you look at the issue of fisheries, which are on the table of the WTO now, it's for end of the year. We are not so close from a solution, but subsidies for overfishing is the same that the subsidies for fossil fuels. That's something which is key for sustainability, achieving SDG, not only in fishery sector as such, but globally, because it's also social. And that's something which is not easy to solve until the end of the year. For 20 years, there was a discussion on that, no agreement. So I cross the finger that something could move, but even if it moved, probably it will not exactly be at the good level. The same for fossil fuels. That's an issue which is, until now, everybody speaks about that, but no decision about it, so sensitive it is. And finally, the CO2 board adjustment is really in the actuality today, especially today. We have made modeling of a CO2 or CO2 board adjustment in UNCTAD in order to look which is the possible consequences for the developing countries, because that's our mandate. And of course, a model is a model, but this model demonstrates that, of course, regarding the price of the ton of CO2, we started with a price of $44 as it is, more or less. But regarding the price of the CO2 ton, the effort is important for the EU and especially for the EU firms, but the results regarding decreasing of CO2 emission and regarding the consequences for developing countries are not so fantastic. I mean, it's a big effort for a result which is not exactly what it could be, or what we hope that it could be regarding CO2, decreasing of CO2 emission, and of course with a lot of potential inequalities between the developing countries. Of course, when you put China in the developing countries, that's something which is of course totally different than some other countries. It means that the poor countries are not really affected, because of course they have no industry intensive in CO2. And so that's an interesting model. We published it today. So I think that it's one piece in the discussion on this CO2 board adjustment that I think it's important that the EU could also, if the decision is taken, if it is compatible with the WTO, that some part of the revenue could be affected for a just transition for the developing country. And I think that that was also one of the recommendations of a resolution of the European Parliament in this regard, because I think that if we would like to address the SDG, we cannot just look at the European wish. Of course, it could be a little bit like the RGDP, European Union starting in order to encourage a generalization or something which become a little bit more standardized, because we know that there are a lot of initiatives in the world regarding CO2 board adjustment, even on national level, and that's also, of course, a forest of different measure, price, etc. And it's really not very clear. Last issue, you spoke, Rebecca, about incentives. I fully agree. But I invite you to listen to or to look at what Esther Duflo, the Nobel Prize in Economy, wrote in her book, because I think that sometimes we have in mind that some incentives are key in order to change or to have, but analyze permanently the effect of your incentive on the ground and regarding the different sector or the different aspect of your measure is so key, because there is a lot of stereotype in the way to look at incentivation, and sometimes without looking really how other factors are intervening and trying to totally disrupt the goal of the incentive. So I think that it's really delicate to find a good incentives, especially when you speak about sustainability and 17 or 16 SDG, which are so diverse in different fields, even if all of them have the same final goal. So yes, there is a lot to do in the EU trade strategy. It's not my role to define the policy of the EU, but it's my role to alert on what could be important for developing countries and how it's important to really reinforce regional economic integration, and really encourage or incentivize with the system of preference, because that's also something. I've had a very interesting hearing with the European Parliament about the system of preference of the EU as such, because it has to be adapted, I think, soon. And I understand very well, as European myself, on the will to elevate the level of criteria scoreboard or sustainable score for each product, etc. But I explained to the member of the European Parliament that be aware, because it's a system for development, it's not a system for trade. And if you increase the level of requirements and totally legitimate regarding the European consumer, you really build new barriers, especially for the small player in the south, which are absolutely not able to address those standards, or they have to pay for certification. That's all the problem of standard, voluntary standard, etc. It's very expensive. It's very difficult to be certified. Which is the quality of the control of the certification, and which is the price for the small player. And it's why the value chain has to be reshaped, because the value chain, who is leading and driven the value chain, is of course the biggest one in the head of the chain. But the small stakeholders of the chain are those who have the less benefits of the chain. So that's something that's the difficult balance between trade policy interests of the European firms, of course, but on the other hand, the capacity not only to satisfy the European market or the European will that I fully share, but the transition has to be paid. And when you look at the countries, so they are affected today after COVID, I think that we cannot avoid to have them in mind in each decision that we are taken, not only on climate and environmental or nature oriented solution, but also regarding the just transition and the capacity for the developing countries, and especially the LDCs, to have access to that, because they are totally beyond the radar. That's just what I wanted to say at that stage.
Thank you, Isabelle. I will immediately give the floor to Luisa Santos. Luisa Santos is Deputy Director General of Business Europe, and we wanted also to have the view of the business sector, because we know many businesses, smaller ones, but also bigger ones, are committed to work towards a more sustainable economy and trade. And also many companies have been asking, and brands have been asking for due diligence legislation, also for clear reasons of level playing field. And so we would like to have your insight on this and to know how the business sector is integrating the SDGs. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Saskia, and good morning or good afternoon for everyone. I mean, on the study, I think it is, and the methodology, I think it is indeed very interesting. But I share Isabelle Durant's comments that this is not a very easy task to measure compatibility between trade or sustainable trade and SDGs. I mean, first, because we are not capturing services, and these are very important, was one of my comments as well, and they are increasing in importance, the services trade, and we have problems actually to measure services trade themselves. Not even talking about sustainable development is one of the big problems we have, is to measure, to have good statistics about what is happening in terms of services trade. And then on the HS codes, we have a lot of problems with them actually on the industry side, because we see that many of the new technologies and the new products are not properly captured by the existing codes. And we know that they are revised on a regular basis, but this revision takes normally some time, and it doesn't match the level of new products coming up and new technologies coming out to the market. So I cautious against, I mean, it's a good basis, but I cautious about the HS codes, because we have a lot of problems with them, even to capture the normal statistics when trying to understand better trade flows between countries. On the broader term about how to make trade more sustainable, a few points from our side. Of course, we are representing the European business, so both big and small, and we have different different ways from companies also to looking at the issue. And we have companies that are actually engaged in sustainable trade because that's their core business. We have other companies that are trying to make their products and their services more sustainable. And these are companies that are in the process of transition. And then we have others that have their core business model still in areas that, according to today's criteria, might not be sustainable in the future. So we have to match all these three differences. And our position is very much on the basis of this existing difference. And my first point is that trade is not actually different from the overall economy. I mean, we are trying to make our economy, our global economy, more sustainable. That's why we are saying also now that we need to use the COVID-19 and the recovery that we will need to build back better or to make the economies more sustainable. So trade goes very much hand in hand with the general situation in the economy. And it needs to be a global effort. I totally understand that COVID is even going to exacerbate, very likely.
You're muted.
So COVID is probably going to increase the inequalities and the differences between developed and developing countries. But for us, it's important, if we are serious about the need to make our economy more sustainable, the need to address climate change, this needs to be a global effort, although recognizing that the speed and the process to achieve it might be different, taking into account the reality, the economic reality of the different players. And of course, for us, the way to achieve it also in Europe and from the side of European economic operators needs to be balanced. We recognize that we might need to do more. We might need to be at the forefront. And that's why we are committed to make a success of the Fit for 55 plans that the Commission has presented today. But the devil, as we say, is in the details. And how we're going to do it. Because there is a strong risk, of course, that we go ahead, we take the risk to transform our economy. I'm not saying it's wrong, but we have to be careful not to jeopardize also our competitiveness, both in Europe as well as in global markets. And this is critical, of course, also for the future of the European economy as a whole. And for us, coming back to trade, it's important that we work in parallel tracks on the process of making trade more sustainable. I think one important aspect is to promote the trade in sustainable goods and services. And how can we do this? Well, we can do it bilaterally, we can do it multilaterally. You all know that we were discussing at the WTO the environmental goods agreement. Those negotiations, unfortunately, for the moment are stopped. We think it's the right moment, or hopefully the right moment, to come back, enlarge it, because as we were saying, services is key today. Rules are also important, so we need to master the liberalization together with the proper rules, and this is critical. And this is also connected to the WTO reform. I mean, Isabelle already mentioned the fishery subsidies, the fossil fuels, but also the industrial subsidies, because we know very well that big players like China continue to massively invest in industrial sectors, not necessarily taking into account the market needs. This creates overcapacity, and this leads also to a non-sustainable development of the economy, and normally also in areas where you have a lot of carbon-intensive sectors. So the industrial subsidies for us is extremely important. And we need to try to incorporate more the environmental angle and the social angle in the WTO. But this has always been proved very difficult. Maybe now it's the right moment to try it again. it's difficult because, of course, some developing countries consider this a way for developed economies to try to protect themselves and to try to prevent them from having access to the markets or creating non-tariff barriers. On the other hand, we have other institutions like the UN for the climate agreement, the UN SCC, and the ILO when it comes to social. I mean, these are the two organizations that normally deal with this aspect. So we need to make sure that they feel that this process, there's also an inclusiveness in this process and they are involved. But I think we definitely need to try to make an effort. Then on the use, the other aspect is, of course, the use of unilateral preferences. The revision of the GSP is coming up. We need to do a good balance, I agree, between demanding more from our trading partners in terms of the scope. But I think we need also to work more on the implementation. And the implementation is key, maybe with stronger support, with stronger capacity building in these countries, because I think the aspect of diversification of the economy in these countries is critical. And what we have seen and continue to see in many cases is that the GSP actually sometimes does not lead to diversification. I mean, this has been a problem for many years, and so we are a bit the chicken and the egg situation here. So we need possibly to see how can we do more through the GSP. The other aspect I wanted to bring is on procurement. We are discussing now a lot of financial support from the government. So it's going to be a lot of public finance coming up to the economies, especially in developed countries. And we need to ensure that whatever public procurement we do, it's more sustainable, it's more transparent. This is not an issue only in Europe and an issue for instance, in China and the way China develops its public procurement, but it's also something that we need to look at, for instance, with the US. I mean, Rebecca mentioned the review of supply chains. We're actually concerned about the review of supply chains in the US because we see it, if we see this as an exercise to close the market, to discriminate negatively foreign companies, including European, as compared to US, this could be problematic. So review in the sense of making supply chains more sustainable, more resilient, but also more transparent, fine. If this is a way to lead to protectionism, we don't think that's the right answer. Another point, and I will finish soon, increase consumer awareness. This is critical. We know that the transition of the economy will cost companies, will cost consumers. I mean, this is a reality. Therefore, we know that the consumer and the European consumer is more aware and more conscious of sustainable products, of sustainable services. But the question is, will they be willing to pay? And pay not just as a niche market, but, you know, the overall consumers. Are they willing to pay? Are they willing to pay the premium for the sustainability? And here, I think we still need to do an effort. So my final remark is on what business can do. And we are ready, and Saskia mentioned the due diligence, and we had already this discussion before. We agree to do more also in terms of supply chains, and we agree to have even mandatory due diligence. For us, the question is how far do we go, and how far is European business going to be responsible and liable for what happens in the supply chains? And this needs to be a good balance. Again, we want to improve. I think the main objective of the due diligence is also to improve the situation in third countries. This is one of the main objectives. And we need to make sure that we have the right conditions to do it, not just create problems for European companies without having a change on the ground. And as Isabelle said, the situation in third markets is sometimes very complex. And we also need to take into account that if the market is small, if the risk is too high for economic operators, especially European economic operators, there is a real risk that they leave the market. And I think this would be something we would not like to see. So we would like them to stay engaged and to improve the conditions on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. Santos. I'm sure there are many questions arising or reactions that you want to deliver, and I will give you a chance to react afterwards, also Rebecca and Isabelle, but I will first give the floor to Stéphanie Ghislain. Stéphanie Ghislain she has many hats, but today she's representing the SDG Watch Europe. Stéphanie, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Saskia. I just hope you don't hear too much the music. I'm just next to Parc Royal for the ones who know, and I don't know what's coming out of there. So I'm going to just share a presentation. It's a bit easier for me. As I said, today I'm talking on behalf of SDG Watch Europe. And so that everybody understands my bias for animals, so you know, I'm also the Trade and Animal Welfare Program Leader at Eurogroup for Animals, the Pan-European Association, Animal Welfare Association. So just you understand my bias. It's important for you for transparency. So, sorry, apologize. So for the ones who do not know, just very, very quickly, SDG Watch Europe is actually a cross-sectoral alliance advocating for ambitious implementation of SDGs. So we are an animal welfare organization, but there are development organization, environmental one, the ones looking at social rights. So it's very, very, very comprehensive. And the key objectives are to coordinate policy and advocacy, monitoring and reporting on how the EU and member states are doing on implementing SDGs, also engaging the public and other stakeholders on the topic, always challenging how we apply those topics. So today I'm going to speak on their behalf. And I wanted to start because everybody talked about how COVID is really a turning point. And I think that's very important to know that this quote comes from the IPBES article, and it's very, I think it says a lot. It's true that the pandemics really showed how much when we actually value profits overall, or economic and trade policies, it really has a very detrimental impact on us. And I think it's very also important to remember that there are costs to these pandemics, and when you have, you will have soon antimicrobial resistance. So at the moment, we don't really cost all those impacts, but sometimes transitioning towards more sustainable trade, more sustainable production system, it can actually save us a lot of cost for later, and that's also very important. Trade for us should always be seen as a tool. It was said in a way several times. It should be there for a reason. It's not an aim in itself just to try to reach trade agreements, to reach agreements at the WTO level. The aim should be somewhere else, and it should be to achieve the SDGs, to contribute to these achievements at least. So we should not be dogmatic, and it's a very good question we have in this seminar. It's not because we criticize sometimes trade. We say, for instance, that not all trade is good trade, that we are anti-trade, or that people are protectionists. I think Luisa really made a good difference when she talked about the new value chain review in the US. It's very different. It's not about, you know, there are some criteria, but protectionism, it's not really the issue here. So I wanted just maybe to give you some points on whether we believe or not that actually trade can be or not sustainable, and what we believe of EU trade policy in general. And at the moment, I would tend to say, as the figures that were shown by Coriolis actually demonstrate, that it's probably not very sustainable at the moment. And I would be also, I have tons of questions throwing my mind on your methodology and looking at that, because it really is something we are lacking in many ways. So I will look into that. At the moment, there are many sustainability-related criteria that we have, standards that we have in the EU that do not apply to imported goods. It's the case, for instance, on animal welfare, but it's not the only field. And so basically, when we increase trade, when we try to have more trade agreements to open further the markets in general, we are potentially fueling any kind of sector undistinctly. There are sustainable ones, very unsustainable ones, and there is no proper way really to monitor that. Maybe your research is actually, helping us with this, but at the moment, it's not very easy to monitor the impact of trade liberalization in any way. And also, even if we would be able to demonstrate such situation, there's no really proper mitigating tools in the current trade agreements, for instance. And I just chose a picture, that's my bias, of a feedlot, for instance, in Uruguay. It's a method of production of beef that's very uncommon in the EU, but very common in the Americas, where we import actually a lot of beef. And, you know, in the absence of any condition on trade preferences, we are basically fueling this method of production, which is very detrimental for animals. I won't go in details, but also for the environment and for public health. As was mentioned, we always talk about COVID, and you might wonder why we make this link with COVID, trade, and economics, because basically one of the major cause of the zoonosis is the land use change created mostly by agriculture, and so the loss of habitat for the wild animals. And so basically may potentially the trade, which has been unconditional trade policies like we have at the moment, has been fueling a lot of intensive farming, for instance, and that is really a major contributor to this land use change and thus to the spread of pandemics. So it has really, let's say, a lot of consequences that are not only about consumer preferences, I would say. It's also about long-term sustainability of our societies. So of course, trade policy cannot fix everything. It's not the aim and it should never do that. But what we believe, at least, is that trade policy should not aggravate existing problems: climate change, biodiversity loss, rise of inequalities. On the public health side, antimicrobial resistance, which is coming, spread of zoonosis. So even better, it should contribute to solve them. As Rebecca said, there are a lot of trade that actually is positive, and we are not anti-trade. We think trade, well regulated, should be able to contribute to this transition. So I want to just jump on some recommendations. I haven't put everything, and a lot of other points were mentioned by Rebecca, by Isabelle as well, and by Luisa. But for instance, one of the key concepts for SDG Watch Europe is to ensure what they call policy coherence for sustainable development. It's very important to really be coherent in all the policy fields. And as was mentioned, I think it was by Rebecca, the SDGs are in every commissioner's portfolio, but they're not really used to assess anything. To give you an example, when you do an impact assessment on a trade agreement and also an ex post study, you don't really look at the impact on every target, not even on every SDGs. You actually look at the impact on certain topics. So it's not very mainstream. So for instance, one of the key points could be material footprint. At the moment, we're not really looking at how much material footprint we have in the EU. We externalize a lot by importing a lot of goods. So we are a bit not assessing all this. So before going into this issue of methodology and data, which I also believe is a very important part of future solutions, it's really important to prioritize the multilateral level. It's been said before, in many ways, bilateral agreements really are difficult for disadvantaged countries, for developing countries. And we need to also address questions that are important for those countries, like the leftovers of the Doha development round and issues around agriculture, for instance, which are important to countries and that have not been really solved since it's been a big crisis at the WTO. We hope now it can change, but at the moment, there's a lot of issues that are on hold. The WTO modernization was mentioned, and I think it's very important. It's important to talk rules and discipline, but it's very important to make sure that citizens can also reconcile with the WTO, because at the moment, there's a very easy feeling that those trade rules don't go hand in hand with sustainability. Might be true. I agree that some rules might have to be changed, but at the moment we have some margin of maneuver, at least thanks to the case law of the WTO, and we should much more handle the impact of the trade rules on SDGs. It was mentioned the fossil fuel subsidies, the fishery subsidies are something we should tackle. We should also tackle, I would say, in the same idea, unsustainable farming subsidies. You know, our subsidies should go towards small scale, humane, sustainable farming, and that would also be good for developing countries. And at the moment, we have still a lot of distorting agricultural subsidies. And maybe another point we should bring up at the WTO level is what we call processes and production methods. So those methods of production that are not visible in the product at the end. Because at the moment, you can only differentiate product and just discriminate them by tariffs, by a ban, anything, if you can actually differentiate them. And there's more and more discussions about those, whether you can or you cannot differentiate a product based on the method of production, like animal welfare, emissions, forced labor, unfair working conditions. The product is the same, but is that really the same product? And that's a real question. And it's up for debate, I would say, because it's not a settled case at the WTO. And a lot of the crises we're facing at the moment, I've mentioned them all, they're mostly related to method of production. And so if we want to be able to tackle them, we need to discuss, and it's better to discuss to avoid unfairness, as we mentioned, protectionism actually through those kind of measures. We need to discuss, because at the moment, a lot of countries actually rely on the exceptions at the WTO to do things. Is that a good method? Maybe not. Maybe we should discuss this and take this opportunity of the momentum on trade and environment to discuss deforestation-related issues, CBAM, we mentioned it, it's also a PPM issue, animal welfare, of course, but you know, all this. And then, of course, at a bilateral level, the EU could do more in terms of greening their FTAs. What we believe as well is that to further promote green trade, as was mentioned, we should make sure that when we grant further trade preferences to countries, it's actually for products that respect at least EU equivalent standards on animal welfare, on climate, on environment, because at the moment, so many of our standards do not apply to imports. And maybe we can't change that very quickly, but in trade agreements, this is bilateral. We could at least decide to just give further access to those products. We should also be much more ambitious on the cooperation front. As was said by Isabelle Durant, I think it's very important to work with the other countries through any channels, trade agreements, cooperation agreements, but be more ambitious about resources, objectives, and not just use those provisions as window dressing to say we're doing something on sustainable development, on any other topic that is important for sustainable development. Also, it's important to open more the oversight of these trade processes. We talked about all the impact assessment. I think the methodology at the moment is very much debated among the stakeholders, and it would be good to have to really rethink it. The EU has now published a new methodology to assess the impact of trade on biodiversity, actually also stating that most of the trade has been detrimental to biodiversity. So that's quite interesting. And I think this is a very good first step, and we should generalize it and try to much more find ways, indicators, very complex task, I agree, to assess the impact on all different SDGs and looking at, we have maybe to select some criteria, but that would be already more comprehensive than what we do now. Improving the timing, doing it at the beginning of any kind of negotiation, really use the findings in those negotiations rather than publish it at the end when the people feel that it was only done as an exercise to demonstrate that it's been taken into account. And finally, it was discussed in the introduction by Saskia, of course, the TSD chapters, which are at this moment a pierre angulaire of like trade and sustainable development in trade agreements. They should be made stronger in terms of language, because if the language is weak, you can't do anything with it. It should probably be with certain countries in commitments that go beyond what's internationally agreed. And it should be more, verifiable what you put in there. And the enforcement should be improved. We can discuss that at length. We believe there should be more sanction at the end if there is nothing happening. The aim is not sanction, is a change on the ground and there is a real issue. And we should have this, action plans and so on. And a good model, for instance, I always believe is like the illegal, unregulated and reported fishing regulation. I think it's a very good thing. And as we discussed a lot about developing countries, I think it's important to remember that all this could be done in respect of the level of development and trying also, as I said, to have much more cooperation and maybe indeed to finance much more through CBAM, what CBAM actually brings to the EU in terms of finances. At some point, a financial transaction tax. It was this at the very beginning when it was discussed. It was actually the aim was actually to use it for aid. Well, now we don't talk about this anymore, but it's very important too. But I strongly believe that some of the what could be considered barriers that we would introduce, they're not only there just because consumers prefer. They're also there because there is a long-term, what's at stake is really long-term sustainability of our societies. And sometimes is it good for the developing countries to make the mistake that we have made in terms of developing, for instance, very intensive animal agriculture? I'm not sure. Developing all kind of diet, not really sure. So it's all about trying to find the best way to balance cooperation, to balance what we put indeed as measures around our market to serve as incentive. But yes, I will stop here and thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Stéphanie, for your interesting insight and your recommendations. I will immediately give the floor to
I'm kind of comforted by the fact that these are all things that we are very much reflecting on inside the Commission, and where we are trying also to find a way forward to improve things, to improve the current situation. Maybe I will start from Rebecca's presentation that kind of kicked off this discussion. I have to say, on a personal basis, I very much like your presentation, Rebecca, because you're bringing together issues which we work on, actually in this cabinet very much, myself personally, trade and sustainability and sustainable finance. But sometimes we don't see the link between them. And so I really like the way you presented, and the fact, for example, that you talked about the green taxonomy, that you talked about the corporate sustainability disclosures, which we proposed just a couple of months ago to improve the current disclosures, what companies have to report when it comes to their ESG activities. And by the way, we are, I think, one of the few jurisdictions, if not the only jurisdictions in the world, that asks company to measure and report based on double materiality. So not only how, for example, climate risk and social factors impact their balance sheet, but also how their activities have a potentially negative impact on the environment and so on. And I think there is obviously, in consequence, a strong link on the activities of the companies, including on their trade. On your study, so I think it's very interesting how you make this link between the trade flows and the SDGs. Obviously, in a way, it's a sort of a snapshot, it's a sort of picture of what is happening, but trade is also a channel in a way, and cannot substitute policies that have to address certain root causes of why we have those trade flows. So, for example, if there is a lot of trade in petroleum products, in fossil fuels, it's not trade that is causing the problem that we are relying too much on fossil fuels. There are other regulatory policies that we have to put into place to address that issue, like what we're doing today, indeed, what we've just done with the Fit for 55 package, or with the sustainable finance measures, where we want to direct financial flows from the private flows more into sustainable activities rather than into non-sustainable activities. So I think this is maybe just the point that I think should be adjusted, let's say, in the narrative about your research, that it's a snapshot, but it's not necessarily that it's because of trade that we have this situation. In reality, we know trade can also be a force of good. So in a way, as you said rightly, we have all this trade in green technologies, green products, green services. If we could measure it, we know it's very difficult to measure trade in services, but that will maybe also give a slightly different picture there. And we also know that trade can be, in a way, emission reducing. So we've seen some studies, for example, on the free trade agreement between the EU and Korea, which shows that thanks to that agreement, there has actually been a reduction in emissions, because there has been some trade distortion effect from trade flows that were more polluting than what has been then the result of this agreement. So I think that the picture is indeed a bit more complex, as Isabelle said, just to complexify a little bit. But having said that, I think it's a very interesting study and something that I hadn't seen before. So thank you for that. Then just to go back a little bit to the issue about developing countries, which is a very important one, I think, and has been raised by many of you. Many of you, for example, have talked about the generalized system of preference. And indeed, we are coming after the summer with a review of the generalized system of preference. We are preparing the reform because we need a new one as of 2024. And here, clearly, we need to strike this balance, because the GSP is first and foremost an instrument for development, for economic development, for trade diversification. But we do agree that it's also an instrument to help countries in meeting SDGs, including developing countries. And that's why, as part of the reform, we also want to give a stronger role to supporting sustainability issues. As you know, this is already an important part of our GSP, but we think we can do more. We can enhance that contribution of the GSP to sustainability issues across different dimensions. So environment, social aspects, governance aspects, human rights. So this is certainly something that we will want to enhance in the future GSP. I cannot say much more because we are still preparing the reform, but you can expect it for after the summer is the Commission proposal, and then we will discuss it obviously with our co-legislators, the Parliament and the Member States. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there is this balance to be struck. You know, it's obviously a vehicle to implement SDGs, but it's also about economic diversification and lifting countries out of poverty. On the trade and sustainable development chapter, so as part, let's say, of our bilateral agenda, we recognize that we need to have a look at our TSD chapters, and in particular how they are enforced and how they're implemented. This is why EVP Dombrovskis decided to bring forward to this year the review that was envisaged for 2023 of the TSD chapters, in particular of their enforcement. We are preparing the open public consultation, which we want to launch before the summer. So let's say in the autumn, we look forward to everybody's input, and there will be occasions to discuss. As the Executive Vice President already announced, we want to have a pretty comprehensive look at the TSD chapters, at the scope, but especially at the enforcement and the implementation. So, for example, what is the role that civil society plays in the monitoring? What is the role of potential different ways of enforcing the non-compliance with those chapters, including sanctions? Clearly, we have to always see to what extent broadening the scope may lead to a different way of enforcing, or on the other way around, because we know, for example, the United States, they have an approach which is very much based on sanctions, but they also, the bar, let's say, to bring a case is higher than what is in the case for the EU. So you have to demonstrate, for example, that there is really a trade impact of that breach. And also the scope, it's not always as large as the one that we push for our free trade agreements. So I think we will really need to look at the balance there and see what's the best way forward. But we want to conclude this review in early 2022, and we want to make sure that we can use the learnings from that review for ongoing and for future negotiations. Obviously, we can do a lot bilaterally, but as many of you have said, we also think that the multilateral channel is always the right approach as let's say, as a first port of call, and we're also very comforted by the inputs that the new Director General of the WTO is giving also to this issue. So we have very high hope for MC12, and we have proposed, for example, a trade and climate initiative in WTO. We really want to mainstream our objectives of the Green Deal into the WTO. And we see that we have a lot of like-minded partners to discuss, for example, fossil fuel subsidies, which need to end, harmful subsidies in fisheries, which we need to tackle. And okay, let's hope that we can really make progress after so many years this year, that it can be this decisive one. We can look again at environmental goods and services. So I think we are quite, let's say, hopeful for this agenda in the WTO, and not only, let's say, on the specific discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, but more general, that this really becomes more mainstreamed in the WTO as part of its reform. And also, I think from the perspective of what we can do unilaterally, so we can do things through our free trade agreements, we can do things in multilaterally, but we can also do things on our own, and we should not shy away, because as you know, the three keywords of our trade policy strategy are open, sustainable, and assertive, and the three can actually go very much together. And we have, for example, the CBAM, which we propose today, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is it's not at all an issue of competitiveness or of level playing field. It's an environmental measure. It's a climate measure to target carbon leakage, and do not have, as a result of our of strengthening of our emission trading scheme and our efforts to put the price on carbon, that we simply make emissions go up somewhere else. And this is why we design it in a way which is, in our view, absolutely WTO compatible. And I hope you will have a chance to pour a bit into the details of the proposal, but we did it really in a way that you will see that as CBAM is phased in, free allowances are phased out. So it's really an environmental and climate measure. But we also have due diligence we are working on, and there is obviously very strong trade effects, trade implications for that. We have also our deforestation proposal, which is coming, which will also be very much focusing on imports of products that is for deforestation. So it's also very active and busy unilateral agenda, if you want to call it that way. But it's motivated by, for us at least, by the need to tackle these issues not only in the EU but globally, environment and human rights and labor rights. We don't see that really as something to protect European companies or to address necessarily issues of competitiveness at level playing field. And this is how we would like to look at these issues. I could speak much more, but I see that we're running a bit of the time, and I think Saskia also wants to give some extra time. So I will just stop there, but thank you very much.
Thank you. And Isabelle Durant is just telling me that she has to leave. So thank you very much, Isabelle. I don't know if you want to take the floor again. I would like to say that, yes, we are running out of time, but what you just mentioned about the upcoming legislations will give us more and many opportunities to put some coherence throughout legislation on due diligence, but also on the review of the TSD chapters, ensuring coherence between our different policies and including more sustainability, but also the respect of human rights. And I insist on this because it's closely linked to the SDGs and almost all of them through our trade policies. And I strongly believe that all the sectors and all the actors need to contribute to this, and trades included. And I also believe, and this is also maybe my message to Business Europe, that consumers are maybe not willing to pay much more, but they're really willing to have more sustainable products and are more and more conscious and care about their impact. And as consumers, and want sustainable products also without violations of human rights at the end of the chain. But what is certain is that we need to work towards more sustainable targets, also with an eye, and this is what Isabelle brought us, with an eye on the impact of our own policies on developing countries. And there as well, we need to reinforce the coherence of our policies. I'm sorry for the participants not to give you the possibility to ask your questions in live, but what I propose is that you put them in the Q&A, and that will answer to you in written if you have any questions to our panelists. And if you have a specific question to a specific panelist, we'll do the intermediary and provide you with an answer. I would like to give the concluding word to Rebecca, because many questions have been also asked to you, and maybe it's good that we do not leave it here, and that your study may help further policy making. Rebecca.
I'll try and keep this very brief because I know we're running out of time, but I think all the points that have been made on the study are well made. The first thing is that when Simon Kuznets first started measuring GDP back in 1934, he was not trying to measure the world. He was trying to measure something very specific, which was economic activity. The study of GDP has grown over the last, well, since 1934, massively. It's nearly 100 years now, and we understand a lot more about what creates GDP. What we're doing here, as Andrea said, is just one small step towards measuring how trade and sustainability work together. And I think when we as a company started looking at sustainable development goals, Our goal was actually very simply, I'm an economist and I simplify things because I work on a principle that if I simplify things first, then I can make it more complicated afterwards. And I think that is exactly our starting point. The banks that are going to be instrumental in helping us to achieve trade sustainability need something simple so that they can give businesses some kind of a passport in the first instance. And that's the problem that we were trying to solve with this study. Let's get this down to something very, very simple. We do include services, actually. We've been through all the EBOPS metrics. We have started looking at services. We understand, and I've been studying trade for a very long time, so I could bore for England on the subject of HS codes and EBOPS codes, and I won't do that right now. But I think the important thing is that we have opened up the conversation. We've started this process of measuring trade in this way. We cover 180 countries, so we're not exclusively European, and we are very engaged with the African Union, with the African Continent Free Trade Area, with the Asian Development Bank, and with Mercosur to try and understand what's happening in emerging markets as well. So we as a company are very committed to this on a global scale. Our contribution is very small. I hope it's a small step, that it may be useful and used as a framework for developing more detail and more complexity in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. As I said, if you have any questions to the panelists, please send them to us. And I will leave it here for today. I want really to thank you for your participation and for the interesting exchanges that we had. Of course, we won't leave it here with the Commission because, you know, we're working hand in hand on all this legislation on trade and more broadly, because it's not only related to trade, of course, but as a member of the International Trade Committee, I'm focusing on the issues related to trade. So thank you again, and we stay in touch. Thank you.